The year was 1945, and the Pacific was a theater of fire, smoke, and despair. On a small island under the Japanese Empire's control, a group of young women huddled in a makeshift barracks, their hands raw from hard labor, their eyes hollow from hunger. They had been prisoners of war for months, stripped of freedom, dignity, and hope. Every day was a battle for survival. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. And yet, as the war raged on thousands of miles away, an unimaginable twist of fate was about to shatter everything they had known. When the doors of the barracks swung open, and they were told they would be sent far from the islands of the Pacific, to the heart of America itself, no one could have imagined the shock that awaited them. For these young Japanese women, the land of the enemy would reveal a truth so unexpected, so quietly powerful. It would leave them questioning everything about courage, humanity, and the world beyond the war. The journey began with the roar of transport ships slicing through rough, gray seas. The women, some barely teenagers, were crammed into cargo holds that smelled of sweat, oil, and fear. The wooden floor beneath them shook with every wave, the metal hull around them vibrating like a living thing, reminding them of the war they had escaped but could never fully leave behind. They whispered to each other in hushed voices, sharing memories of home gardens, distant brothers, and the fleeting hope of life before the war. But the world had grown cruel, and hope was a fragile thing. Above them, officers barked orders in clipped English and Japanese, the sounds foreign and commanding, pulling them further into an uncertain future. Each day on the ship felt like a lifetime. The sun would rise, glaring like a spotlight on the prisoners' thin faces, illuminating the scars of hunger and the quiet terror in their eyes. Nights were colder, filled with the endless rhythm of waves against steel and the occasional distant boom of artillery from islands, still under conflict. The women slept in rows, their bodies pressed together for warmth, dreams haunted by the memories of friends who had disappeared in the chaos of bombed-out villages, executions, and disease. Even in these moments of shared misery, an unspoken question burned. What awaited them on the other side of the ocean? Could this new land bring liberation or more suffering? When the ships finally docked on the unfamiliar shores of America, the women were struck by a strange silence, the kind that makes a person's heart pound with both fear and disbelief. The air was thick but clean, scented with pine and smoke from distant factories. They were led through long lines of soldiers, the clang of boots on metal echoing like a drum in their chests. Here, in this land of their enemies, nothing looked familiar. Houses stood tall and orderly, trees were massive and untouched by war, and the sky, the sky stretched endlessly in a way that seemed almost impossible. For the first time in months, a flicker of something new appeared in their hearts. Curiosity, cautious and trembling, but undeniable. Then they saw them, men, tall, broad-shouldered, with faces weathered by the sun and eyes that held both gentleness and strength. Soldiers who carried weapons, yes, but also the quiet patience of people who had survived unimaginable battles themselves. These men moved among them with a surprising ease, offering water, blankets, and small comforts that the women had not experienced in months or years. Shock rippled through the group. They had been raised to believe these men were monsters, their very presence a threat. Yet here, in this strange, orderly world, these soldiers were not the embodiment of fear, they were human. Compassionate, surprisingly human. Some of the women gasped silently at the size of their hands, the kindness in their gestures, the way they laughed quietly among themselves, despite the chaos of war still echoing in their minds. It was bewildering, disorienting, and above all, transformative. For the women, every moment in this new land was a test of courage. To accept help meant surrendering pride. To trust meant risking betrayal. To look at these men without suspicion meant daring to hope. And yet, as the first night fell over the American camp, with the crackle of fires and the distant hum of trains carrying soldiers and goods alike, A quiet realization settled over them. Survival was no longer just about enduring brutality. It was about seeing humanity in a world that had long denied it. And somewhere, deep in their bones, they knew that their journey across the ocean had changed them forever. The first days in the American camp were a jolt to every sense the women had left intact. The barracks were clean, orderly, and alarmingly spacious compared to the cramped, suffocating cells they had known. Wood floors creaked under their feet, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee drifted through the air, a strange, almost forbidden luxury after months of rancid rations and stale rice. Outside, the fields stretched endlessly, dotted with tents, small workshops, and lines of soldiers moving with a precision the women had never imagined. Every sound, the whistle of a train, the bark of a commanding officer, the laughter of men unguarded by fear, felt like an assault and a balm at once, yet the relief was fragile. Fear lingered like a shadow in every corner of their minds. Could they truly trust these men, these so-called enemies? Some of the women refused to speak, their eyes darting nervously at every tall figure passing by. Others could not stop staring, captivated by the sheer human size. The unfamiliar warmth in these men's faces, the way their shoulders moved like unyielding shields. Yet their hands handled fragile objects, bread, water, blankets with surprising tenderness. They were caught between awe and terror, curiosity and instinctive caution. And every step forward felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of uncertainty. The soldiers themselves were a study in contradictions. Some barked orders with a sharpness that reminded the women of their former captors, while others offered small kindnesses that defied their expectations. One young man, tall and broad, with a voice calm enough to soothe but firm enough to command, handed a woman a warm blanket and knelt to meet her eyes, whispering words in broken Japanese. She recoiled, then froze, then slowly accepted it, feeling a strange pulse of gratitude she could not name. She had expected brutality. She had expected judgment. Instead, she found patience. She found humanity. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. Fear was no longer the only language she could speak. Meals became their first real tests. Sitting together at long tables, the women watched soldiers eat in a way that was both familiar and foreign. They marveled at the abundance of food, meat, bread, vegetables, even desserts, things they had only seen once in the fading memories of home. A small hand reached for a piece of bread, trembling with hesitation, and a soldier noticed, smiled gently, and offered it without demand or expectation. Some women burst into silent tears, overwhelmed by a kindness they had never known, a generosity they had not dared imagine existed. Others clenched their fists in secret, wrestling with shame, disbelief, and the strange sensation of hope stirring inside them. The camp was also a place of work, but work that carried a strange dignity. The women were assigned tasks, cleaning, cooking, laundry, not as punishment, but as contributions. For the first time, labor did not feel like chains. It felt like a bridge, a way to belong, a way to reclaim agency over their own lives. Some of the soldiers watched over them quietly, others engaged them in conversation, curious about lives that had been shattered by war. Every exchange was a minefield of emotion, pride, shame, relief, fear, and a trembling curiosity about a world that was both terrifying and beautiful. Yet, even amidst these moments of fragile peace, the war was never far away. Letters from distant relatives, stories whispered about ongoing battles, the occasional blackout drill, all reminded the women that they were still outsiders, still vulnerable. Every night, as they lay on thin mattresses listening to the distant rumble of trains and the occasional bark of an officer, they wrestled with questions they could not yet answer. Could they forgive? Could they trust? Could they even imagine a life beyond this strange, enormous camp, where men were not monsters but towering, kind-hearted strangers? And deep inside, An ember began to glow, a sense that courage was not only surviving what had happened, but learning to see the humanity in those who had once been enemies. Weeks passed, and the women began to notice the small, almost imperceptible gestures that carried meaning far beyond words. A hand offered without expectation, a nod of acknowledgement, a blanket draped over shoulders in silence, all of it slowly chipped away at the walls they had built around themselves. Their minds, once filled with the rigid teachings of obedience and suspicion, now wrestled with conflicting emotions: fear, awe, and a fragile curiosity about the people they had been taught to despise. The camp, with its rhythm of chores, laughter, and quiet labor, became a strange laboratory for human understanding, where trust was tested not in grand declarations, but in tiny, deliberate acts. One morning, as dawn painted the sky with streaks of gold and smoke from distant chimneys mingled with the cold, crisp air, a group of women were assigned to a field outside the main camp. The task seemed simple: sorting supplies, carrying crates, tidying the grounds, but the physical exertion reminded them of the back-breaking labor they had endured in captivity. Yet, unlike before, there was no shouting, no cruelty, no threat pressing down like steel. Instead, the men worked alongside them, offering guidance with quiet patience. One tall soldier, with broad shoulders and a voice that seemed to steady the very air, bent down to lift a crate with one of the women, showing her a technique that spared her aching back. Their hands brushed briefly, accidentally, and the world seemed to pause for a heartbeat. Shock rippled through her. He was an enemy, and yet he was helping her, teaching her, sharing strength without fear. She caught herself staring at him, and in that moment, the walls around her heart trembled. Night brought a different kind of intimacy. Around campfires, smoke curling into the night sky, some of the women dared to speak about their homes, their families, the lives that had existed before the war tore them apart. The men listened, not with judgment, but with attention so complete it made the women feel seen for the first time in years. Words carried weight, every sentence tinged with longing, loss, and the tentative hope of understanding. The crackle of firewood, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft murmur of voices became a soundtrack of healing, a rhythm in which fear could coexist with cautious trust. It was in these quiet moments that the women began to see the men not as towering figures of threat, but as humans capable of grace, courage, and empathy. But the psychological scars of war are not so easily erased. Some nights, memories surged like violent storm's flames consuming villages, the screams of comrades, the cold, unfeeling eyes of captors. When these memories struck, the women froze, shivering under blankets, and the men who had known their own horrors on distant battlefields stood watch silently, offering silent presence rather than empty words. A tall soldier once sat beside a girl trembling from a nightmare, not saying a word, letting her feel that she was not alone. His silence spoke louder than anything else. It was a declaration of shared humanity, a bridge built not from orders or demands, but from presence, patience, and quiet understanding. Gradually, a fragile trust took root. Letters were exchanged, small gifts offered, a pencil, a photograph, a warm piece of bread. Every act of generosity was a rebellion against the narrative of hatred they had been raised to believe. The women began to notice the men's imperfections: calloused hands, scarred faces, quiet moments of doubt, the fatigue of long days under the sun. They saw vulnerability and strength, courage intertwined with fear. And slowly, they realized that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. In the sprawling foreign landscape of America, among towering strangers, these women began to reclaim their sense of self, learning that survival was not only a matter of endurance, it was also the willingness to see the humanity in others, even those who had once been enemies. Life in the American camp had settled into an uneasy rhythm. But peace is never absolute, especially for those who have lived through war. One afternoon, a sudden alarm shattered the quiet. The blare of sirens, the pounding of boots on gravel, and the sharp commands of officers sent hearts racing. The women froze, memories of air raids and executions rising like smoke in their minds. Were they being punished? Was this another test of endurance? Their bodies tensed with fear, muscles tight, breaths shallow. The soldiers moved with practiced precision, guiding them toward safety, their tall figures cutting reassuring shapes against the harsh sunlight. And in that moment, the women realized that courage was contagious, seeing these men act without hesitation. Shielding them with authority and care sparked something deep within their own trembling hearts. The camp also brought unexpected challenges beyond fear. Cultural barriers loomed like invisible walls, separating them from a life they were desperate to understand. Simple things, language, gestures, food, even laughter were puzzles to decode. At the mess hall, one girl struggled to open a can of beans, her fingers trembling. A soldier noticed, smiled, and stepped forward, carefully demonstrating the motion. She flinched, expecting mockery, but he only nodded encouragement. Over the next few weeks, such small acts became lessons in humanity. Every shared meal, every corrected word, every gentle gesture chipped away at fear and built an unlikely bond. The women began to understand that courage was not just about surviving death. It was also about surviving trust. Surviving hope in a world that had trained them to fear it. One of the most profound tests came unexpectedly, in the form of a medical emergency. One girl collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition, her body too weak to rise. Panic spread among the others as memories of untreated illnesses and the lack of care in their former captivity surged. But the American medics, soldiers trained in efficiency and care, acted swiftly. Needles, blankets, and gentle reassurances replaced fear. The tall men, those once intimidating strangers, worked tirelessly, monitoring her condition, sharing whispered instructions, holding her hand when she trembled. The women watched in awe, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear, relief, and disbelief. For the first time, they saw selflessness in action, courage intertwined with compassion, strength measured not in weapons, but in protection and care. Even amidst these acts of heroism, tension persisted. Not all soldiers were patient, and the memories of cruelty sometimes re-emerged in harsh tones or strict rules. The women had to navigate each encounter carefully, learning which gestures were safe, which moments required caution. Every choice, when to speak, when to act, when to trust, felt like walking a tightrope above a chasm of unknown danger. And yet, the repeated kindnesses, the persistent patience of those who chose empathy over command, began to reshape their understanding of humanity. Fear slowly transformed into a kind of respect, and respect blossomed into gratitude, and finally, into the faintest hint of attachment. By the end of the section, the women were no longer just surviving, they were participating. They contributed to the camp, assisted soldiers, learned new skills, and even began teaching some of the men about Japanese customs, food, and language. Each act was a small rebellion against the war that had tried to define them as weak, powerless, or other. Each gesture of courage, each moment of trust, was a declaration that they could reclaim agency over their lives. And in the quiet of the night, under stars unpolluted by smoke and fire, they began to understand something profound. Courage is not always loud or violent. Sometimes courage is quiet. Sometimes it is the decision to open one's heart when every lesson of history has trained you to shut it. Months passed, and the camp began to feel like an improbable sanctuary, a place where the impossible had quietly become real. The women, once trembling with fear at the sight of tall American soldiers, now walked among them with a careful but growing sense of confidence. They carried themselves differently, their shoulders no longer bent with constant vigilance. Each interaction, each shared meal, each day of labor had become a thread weaving a new fabric of courage and resilience. And yet, the memory of the war, the screams, the hunger, the endless terror remained, like smoke lingering in the corners of a room. It was not forgotten, but it no longer controlled them. One afternoon, a special ceremony was held to honor the soldiers' efforts in caring for prisoners of war. The women were invited to participate, their voices hesitant, but their presence deliberate. As they stood on the stage, rows of tall men in uniform before them, the enormity of what they had survived and what they had learned crashed over them. The faces of the soldiers, the very same ones who had once seemed terrifying, were now marked by patience, kindness, and quiet strength. In that moment, the women realized that heroism was not defined by battles won or enemies defeated, but by the courage to act with humanity when all else encouraged cruelty. They saw before them not soldiers, but ordinary men who had chosen extraordinary compassion. Men whose actions reminded them that morality could thrive even in the shadow of war. The women also reflected on themselves, and the depth of their own transformation stunned them. They had arrived as captives, hollowed by fear, taught to see the world in black and white, bound by the rigid rules of obedience. Yet here, in the heart of an enemy's land, they had discovered that courage was not merely surviving, it was daring to trust, daring to learn, daring to extend kindness even when it might not be returned. They had witnessed the fragility and resilience of humanity in its purest form. And more than anything, they had discovered that even the most ordinary people, soldiers, prisoners, caretakers, could perform acts of quiet heroism that changed lives and challenged long-held beliefs, the bonds forged in silence, in shared labor, in the unspoken understanding of pain, endured beyond the confines of the camp. When the time came to leave, to return to homes scarred by war and suspicion, the women carried with them more than survival. They carried a profound understanding of human dignity. They understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. They realized that heroism often hides in everyday acts, lifting a crate for someone too weak to carry it, offering a blanket to a trembling stranger, sitting quietly beside someone in pain. These were the acts that reshaped history in the small, imperceptible ways that no textbook could ever capture. And as they boarded the trains, to return to a world still fractured by conflict, the women looked back one last time at the men who had guided, protected, and inspired them. They saw not enemies, but a reflection of what humanity could be at its best: tall, imperfect, compassionate, and brave. And in that reflection, they found a universal truth: courage is contagious. Empathy is revolutionary, and ordinary people, when they act with integrity and heart, can change the course of lives, even the course of history itself. The world may be defined by conflict, but it is redeemed by moments of quiet, steadfast humanity. In that realization, hope took root, stronger than fear. And their journey across oceans, across cultural divides, across the darkest valleys of despair, became a testament to the enduring power of courage, compassion, and the unyielding human spirit.